Good afternoon, and thank you for being here. I know that you guys still know me as Professor Schreier, but I just want to say that this guest lecture by Professor Marat Greenberg, who comes here from Portland, Oregon, is sponsored by a number of programs that I'd like to thank. The Institute for Liberal Studies here at BC, the program for Jewish Studies, the East European Studies interdisciplinary minor, and of course, last but not least, our own Department of Eastern Slavic and German Studies. I'm very, very happy to welcome my great colleague and friend, Marat Greenberg. I'm going to introduce him very briefly, but you should know that he's one of the most prolific and original scholars of both Jewish culture coming from Eastern Europe and also of cinema. He was born in Ukraine, and as you can imagine, everything that's going on today has special significance and resonance for our speaker, and emigrated to the United States in 1993. He studied at the Jewish Theological Seminary at Columbia University and received his PhD at the University of Chicago, and he is presently a professor of Russian and Humanities at Reed College in Portland, Oregon. I'm sure you've heard of this fine school. Just a small digression, if some of you remember, I think one class ago, we played a clip from Marian Kutseyev's film, which is a fiction film which incorporates an actual poetry reading at the Polytechnic Museum. And I played a clip in which the poet Boris Slutsky speaks mainly about the demographic crisis in Russophone poetry created by World War II, and then reads a little bit. So Marat is the foremost specialist in Boris Slutsky. He wrote the first major book about him, which came out in 2011 in English and then was translated into Russian. He also published a very important book about the filmmaker Alexander Askordov, who is very famous for his film The Commissar. He also edited a collection about Woody Allen called, and I love the title, Woody on Rye, Jewishness in the films and plays of Woody Allen. Now, he has been working more recently on the project that he will be talking to us today, the Soviet Jewish Bookshelf, which is the title of his most recent book that was just published by Brandeis University Press. But I should also tell you that he's working on a new project, and perhaps if we have time, if you could tell us a little more about it, which is a project that deals with science fiction coming out of the Soviet Union, Eastern Bloc, in which Jewish writers had a special place. And in general, if I could put it this way, I think what Professor Greenberg does is he finds a way to explain how, particularly in post-war, post-Stalinist Soviet culture, various ethno-religious minorities found a way of expressing themselves between the lines, found a way of circumventing what the regime required and also prescribed. And I find it particularly relevant to our course because what we're studying here is precisely the time when writing and speaking between the lines becomes central, starting with the thought. So with that in mind, I'm very happy to welcome Professor Marat Greenberg, and the title of his talk is The Soviet Jewish Bookshelf, its authors and readers. Welcome.
Thank you, Maxim. Thank you, Professor Schreier. It's wonderful to be here, and you're lucky to have such an amazing professor and scholar of Russian literature, Russian Jewish literature. So I'm going to talk today, I guess, for about 45-50 minutes, yeah, and then I hope there will be questions. If there are questions before, please don't hesitate to ask. Yeah. Okay, so the Soviet Jewish bookshelf. So before we jump into the kind of the nitty-gritty, the content of my book, let's talk a little bit more generally about Soviet Jews, Soviet Jewish history, kind of the Soviet Jewish experience in the 20th century. And let me ask you a question, because some of you might have taken courses in modern Jewish history, cultural literature, and I'm sure that some of these questions have come up in your course with Professor Schreier. When I say Soviet Jews, yeah, what comes to mind? Is there anything that kind of pops into your head? Yes. And tell me your name.
Aiden.
Aiden.
The Refusnik movement.
The Refusnik movement. Okay, wonderful.
The Doctor's Blood.
The Doctor's Blood. Okay, great. So there's some real historical knowledge here. Excellent. Anything else? Yeah, so both of these kind of touch on the history of persecution, right? Touch on the history of Soviet Jews very much as victims of the Soviet regime. Yeah? And that is absolutely correct, and these are kind of very important parts of Soviet Jewish history, of Soviet Jewish identity. But what my book does, what I'm trying to do in my book, is to challenge some of the assumptions and challenge kind of the dominant image of Soviet Jewry that exists in the West and that exists particularly in the United States. Yeah? So I'm going to give you these three images that I think sort of encapsulate or capture some of that sort of idea of what Soviet Jewry represents to the American person. Yeah. So the first one on the left very much has to do with Aidan, what you said, kind of the Refusnik movement, yeah, and the idea, right? So here we have this poster. Student struggle for Soviet Jewry. What is the date there? But let's say it comes from 1970s, early 1980s, something like that. Yeah. So in three languages: Отпусти народ мой, let my people go, Shlach et Ami. Yeah, so the struggle to get the Soviet Jews out, which again very much kind of paints Soviet Jews as victims of the Soviet regime, right? Somebody who doesn't, Soviet Jews, meaning that they really don't belong in the Soviet Union, right? And they want to get out. Yeah. So what do we have in the middle? Anybody? Who is this? Fiddler on the Roof. Anybody seen Fiddler on the Roof? No? Come on, go home and watch Fiddler on the Roof. Pretty good film. Chaim Topol, who passed away just a few weeks ago, a couple of months ago. Yeah. So Fiddler on the Roof. Yeah, based on the cycle of stories by Sholem Aleichem, the classic of modern Yiddish literature. And I think in the minds of American Jews, there is kind of that conflation between Soviet Jewry and the traditional world of Russian Jewry, right? Even though it precedes the Soviet Union, but the idea of the old country, sort of that's what it is. Yeah. And the final image, this very, very important book written by Elie Wiesel. Yeah, probably the name means, you're familiar with Elie Wiesel, one of the great writers who was one of the first to deal with the Holocaust, himself survivor of Auschwitz. Yeah. So Elie Wiesel goes to the Soviet Union in the early 1960s and writes this book, which he calls The Jews of Silence. Yeah? Where he calls Soviet Jews the Jews of silence, again, meaning they're very much victims. Yeah? They're unable to practice their religion. They want to get out. Yeah? And then he turns it around, Elie Wiesel, and he calls American Jews the Jews of silence. Why? Because he says you American Jews are doing nothing to help your brethren and sisters in the Soviet Union, which kind of directly leads to this, right? So both, yeah, and Jews of silence in the Soviet Union, and then American Jews who should stop being silent and should start helping the Soviet Jews. So that is the image of the Soviet Jew, right? Sort of traditional old country, and first and foremost victims. And second, kind of really wanting to be religious, right? Really wanting to go back to Judaism and observe. Yeah, I'm not saying that this is incorrect. To some extent, it is correct. Yeah, but what I'm arguing in my book is that the world of Soviet Jewry, the world of Soviet Jewish culture, particularly in the post-World War II period, post-Holocaust period, the period after Stalin's death, was much, much richer than just the victimhood and the persecution. Yeah, and kind of cultural anthropologists, sociologists, they use these two terms when they talk about culture. They talk about thick culture and they talk about thin culture. Yeah. So thin culture, and this is how primarily Soviet Jewish identity has been understood previously. Yeah. So thin culture means that you sort of know that you're different. Yeah, you kind of have this intuitive understanding of your difference, but there is nothing else that supports it. There's no knowledge. There is really no culture. There are just these kind of bits and pieces. So that's thin culture. Yeah. And then there's thick culture, which means that it's not just intuitive, but in fact your understanding of your identity, your understanding of the difference that you feel and represent is rooted in knowledge. Yeah. So if before Soviet Jewish identity has been primarily understood as thin culture, right? Meaning Soviet Jews knew they were different, but they really did not know much about Judaism, about Jewish history, about Jewish culture. Yeah, that's where it ended. I'm saying no, it was thick. Yes, it was fragmentary. Yes, it very much had to do with the history and reality of persecution. Yeah, but there's a lot more content in what that Soviet Jewish identity and culture meant and consisted of. Yeah, are you with me so far? Makes sense. Okay. So how do I get to that? Why am I able to argue that? I'm able to argue that through this idea of the bookshelf, the Soviet Jewish bookshelf. So this is probably, I don't know, 10, 11, 12, 9, something like that, in my parents' apartment in the city of Khmelnytsky in Ukraine. Yeah, again, as Professor Schreier says, very much in the news today for very unfortunate reasons. And behind me, what do you see? You see a bookcase, right? So pretty much any Soviet apartment, or at least Soviet apartment of intelligentsia, kind of educated professionals, would contain a bookcase, which was kind of the centerpiece of that apartment. Yeah, and so what I argue in my book is that the bookcases in Soviet Jewish apartments, in Soviet Jewish homes, had the same installments that you would find everywhere else. The classics of Russian literature that I'm sure you talked about in your courses with Professor Schreier. Yeah, but there would also be special installments that signaled Jewishness. In other words, reading certain books, reading them in a special way becomes really, really important for expressing one's Jewishness and for finding Jewish knowledge, right? So to answer this question, what does Jewishness mean in Soviet context? How to recreate the realities of Soviet Jewish culture? How to challenge this idea of Soviet Jews as Jews of silence? We need to go back to here, right? So, and why? So let's think of this kind of a short historical overview. If we go back to the 1920s, after the creation of the Soviet Union, the dominant ideology of the Soviet government in that period is the idea of internationalism, right? Meaning that all nations, all ethnicities that are part of the Soviet Union, they're all equal, and they have an absolute right to express themselves in their national language and to build their national cultures with socialist content. Jews belong in that category. So Jews are recognized as a legitimate ethnicities from early on in Soviet history. So Judaism as a religion is persecuted like any other religion, right? So the Soviet state, when it's created, it's a militant atheist state that says that all religions are anathema, opium for the masses, as Lenin put it. Judaism belongs in that category, just like churches and mosques are blown up by the Soviet government. In the 20s, the same happens with synagogues, yeah? But Jews as an ethnicity is absolutely legitimate, and you have a flourishing of Yiddish culture, Yiddish literature, Yiddish theater, even Yiddish cinema to some extent, in the Soviet Union in the 1920s and even throughout the 1930s, when Stalin is already in power. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, the Soviet government always believed that this idea of kind of educating Jews in Yiddish and supporting Yiddish culture would be short-lived. Yeah? The ultimate goal is that Soviet Jews would assimilate into a wider culture, would start speaking Russian or other languages, Ukrainian, for instance, yeah, and would just become a part of this new socialist society. And that is exactly what was happening, right? So if we look at the generations of those who are already born in the Soviet Union, they stop speaking Yiddish, yeah, they're speaking Russian, yeah, but they still have a very distinct sense of their difference. And as we get into World War II, on the one hand, you have Soviet Jews fighting in the Red Army against the Nazis. Yeah, you have Soviet Jewish intelligentsia, Jewish professionals everywhere. But you already see that the Soviet government, Stalin, is starting to change its policy toward Jews. And you have the start of pretty severe anti-Semitism already during the war, and then it explodes after the war, so after the Holocaust, in the last years of Stalin's rule. So I think you mentioned Doctor's Plot, right? So you have a number of these anti-Semitic campaigns. The first one, Anti-Cosmopolitan Campaign, 1948, which essentially says that Jews have double loyalty, right? They're not loyal to their country, to the Soviet regime. They're hiding behind all these names, yeah? And that affects everybody. Yeah, people are fired from their jobs. If you're a student in university, there's tremendous persecution. Yeah, and then the Doctor's Plot, where you have these top medical doctors arrested, accused of wanting to poison the top party officials, and it is explicitly stated that most of these doctors are Jews. The next stage of Stalin's idea of what to do with Jews was to take the entire Jewish population from the European part of the USSR and put them in the camps in Siberia in the north, which would have led to many of them dying, yeah, being worked to death. The idea was that they would be re-educated. I should mention that some historians still dispute it, because we don't have sort of the exact document where Stalin says that's what you have to do. But I think most historians would agree that that indeed was the plan. It doesn't happen. Why doesn't it happen? Because Stalin dies. Stalin dies on Purim, right, this Jewish holiday, and some see a significance, sort of a significance in that. Then we come to the 1950s, the period that I know you've been discussing in your course, the period of the thaw, period of the thaw. Nikita Khrushchev is in power, right? He says certain mistakes were made under Stalin, yeah? And that leads to a huge opening of Soviet society to these liberal reforms and a renaissance in culture, in literature, in theater, in cinema, in visual arts, everywhere, right? Much greater openness of Soviet society to the West. So where are the Jews at this point? The Jews at this point, by and large, again, are a part of this society, yeah, speaking Russian, but at the same time knowing that they are different. But how do they express that difference? Most of them are not religious. Most of the synagogues have been closed. The only synagogues that are open are in the big cities like Moscow and Leningrad and Kiev, right? How do you express that difference? Because the problem is that even though on paper Jews are a legitimate ethnicity, there is even a Jewish autonomous region in Siberia and Azerbaijan where the official language is Yiddish, but in reality there is always anti-Semitism that happens behind doors and that affects everybody, and also there is no public space for expressing one's Jewishness. So you would go through your entire education, from kindergarten until university, and not once would Jews be mentioned in history books, yeah, or any other textbooks. It's as if they did not exist, yeah. So how can then I argue that Soviet Jewish culture was thick? Because that thickness needs knowledge, and this is where this comes into play, right? Because the Soviet regime did allow for quite a few books to be published. And remember, this is the Soviet Union, where everything that's published is under government control. Yes, they're underground networks, but I'm not talking about that. Yeah, I'm talking about books that are accessible pretty much to everybody. Yeah, there are books that are published, and I'll talk about them. Some of them are fiction, some of them are kind of scholarly works. Yeah, that do have quite a bit of information about Jews, and so those books become the source of Jewish knowledge, right? Become a way, just like kind of scripture, the Hebrew Bible, rabbinic writings, were so important for Jews throughout millennia. So these books for Soviet Jews kind of become a replacement for that. Yeah? Again, it's fragmentary. All of this exists within this authoritarian atmosphere. And this is where this idea of reading between the lines is so important. We'll get to that in a second. Yeah? But essentially that's why kind of that the bookshelf is so important. The idea of reading as the source of one's identity. Yeah? So far, clear? Any questions at this point? Yes?
Well, even if they were fragmentary
Yes.
traces of Jewishness, and these were published by the regime, why were even fragmentary bits allowed in the literature?
That is an excellent question that has to do with sort of how Soviet censorship worked. And sometimes it works sort of kind of in these unpredictable ways, right? And it was sort of this behemoth, this machinery that had different layers. And as we look at our concrete examples, I think it will become clearer to you, yeah? But your question is absolutely right, because sometimes it's unclear why certain things were published and certain things were not published.
And then after they were published and they were included, was it not picked up on that there were these?
Sometimes that would be the case also, sometimes, which is why, well, we'll get to some of those books, which means that if you have those books that were published and now are not okay, you need to hide them very, very deep in that bookcase because you're going to get into trouble. Yes?
Were a lot of books published abroad instead of within the Soviet
No,
Union?
no. So you cannot get books that are published abroad, unless they're published in countries of the kind of the Soviet bloc, in other socialist countries sometimes. Yeah. There's tons of books that are translated. So, for instance, American literature is tremendously popular in the Soviet Union during the thaw and afterwards, right? But if you, as a Soviet writer who cannot get published in the Soviet Union, choose to get published abroad in the West, then you're a traitor to your country, and you're going to pay for it very dearly. Yeah.
And this was all standard across the entire Soviet Union.
Absolutely.
There was, so same in Ukraine as in.
Yes, there are of course differences, right? And again, that's why a project like this is difficult, project of my book, because Jews did not constitute an official community. Like, think about in the United States, I mean, there are Jewish community centers, right? I mean, there are synagogues. You can be a member in a synagogue. You can be a member in the Jewish community center. There's nothing like that in the Soviet Union, right? So again, you kind of have to piece these fragments together. Were there regional differences? Of course. But at the same time, I think we can get a pretty good picture of sort of things that unified everybody. Yeah. So let's look at some of these concrete examples. So here is sort of my reconstruction early on as I was writing the book of the Soviet Jewish bookshelf, kind of putting together these volumes that constituted it. Some of them came from my own parents' bookcase. Some of them I got somewhere else. So very briefly, I don't know if you talked about Osip Mandelstam in the course, yeah, but Mandelstam, great Russian 20th century poet who was also Jewish, and Jewishness kind of occupies a very interesting place in his body of work, killed by Stalin later on. So the idea of the bookshelf is a very interesting and important concept in modern Russian culture in general, in modern Jewish culture in general, right? So one of the models that I use comes from Osip Mandelstam, who writes in his autobiography called The Noise of Time, Shum Времени in Russian. He writes about a bookcase in his parents' home, yeah, where he says that there were all these different levels. And on the bottom level, on the bottom sort of part of the bookcase, you would find all these Jewish books that were dusty and untouched. And you go up, you find the Russian classics and the German classics. Yeah. So Mandelstam talks about his parents' bookcase as a geological bed that need to be excavated. And I take that idea, right? And I sort of reconstruct the Soviet Jewish bookshelf. I'll also look at it as a geological bed, right? So there is sort of a project, a cultural archaeology that's at place here. And we can look at others. For instance, we can look at Chaim Nachman Bialik, great Hebrew poet, also comes from Ukraine, comes from the Russian Empire, who also talks about the bookcase in some very, very interesting ways. We can come back to it if there will be questions. Yeah, and then I use this idea of writing and reading between the lines, which comes from this thinker, Leo Strauss, yeah, who comes from Germany. After Hitler comes to power, he leaves Germany and is in the United States, and he teaches for the rest of his life at the University of Chicago. And what Strauss says is that when you live in an authoritarian society, when you live in a totalitarian society, and you're a writer, you're a thinker, and you're afraid that you will be persecuted for your ideas, you develop this special way of writing, what he calls writing between the lines, which means that your text has at least two layers. On the one hand, it says something very simple to everybody. This is what he calls an exoteric layer. But then there is a deeper layer that is accessible only to a select few who know how to access it and who speak kind of that secret language. This is what he calls esoteric. So writers write between the lines, and readers need to know how to read between the lines. So that idea is absolutely essential to the Soviet Jewish bookshelf, right? In general, Soviet readers, Soviet intelligentsia needed to learn how to do that because, again, you live in a society that is closed off, where you cannot obtain the knowledge that you really want. So you need to know how to play the game. Now, interestingly and tragically, it is happening again as Russia today is becoming a much more authoritarian country. It's not quite where it was during the Soviet period in terms of censorship, but still, yeah? If today in Russia you cannot say the word war, vойна, in relation to the war that Russia is waging against Ukraine, you need to find ways around it, yeah? So this idea is very, very pertinent, yeah? So when I look at the Soviet Jewish bookshelf, I look at these different layers, just like Mandelstam did with his parents' bookcase. And what do we find in these layers? On the one hand, there are translations, and I'll talk about some of them. Yeah. What I'm interested in is literature that was read and literature that was not read. That would be in this bookcase, but it would be there kind of for symbolic purposes. Was not really read. I'm looking at kind of literature that was marginal, but also canonical, meaning that everybody had it. Something that was very accessible, and something that was not accessible. Let's say books that you could get only if you lived in Moscow or Leningrad, yeah, and not in the periphery. I'm looking at literature that was meant for children, but also literature, of course, meant for the adults. Literature that was thematic, Jewishly, right? That was Jewish in theme, but also literature that kind of had that hidden Jewish content. And this is where you need that idea of reading between the lines. I'm looking at the cult works, again, sort of works that were elevated to this cult status. And I think that the works, the Holocaust, which again in the Soviet Union, on the one hand, after World War II, this World War II, what was called Great Patriotic War, Великая Отечественная война, is a huge part of Soviet mythology. Because you could hardly find a family that did not have somebody who did not perish at the front. Yeah, it's in people's bones and blood, that memory. But the Holocaust, specifically as a Jewish catastrophe, was obfuscated, was not talked about by and large, again, except primarily for a few books that did include it, and that became so important for Soviet Jews. Yeah. And so again, these kind of reading strategies, how it was read, becomes very important. Yeah. So far, so good. Okay. Yes.
The Holocaust was widely known about by Jews in the Soviet Union, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Absolutely. So yes. Right. And how that memory of the Holocaust was carried out. Yeah. It primarily was done through reading, through books. There were also other ways. For instance, monuments that were put up by Jews on the places of massacres. Yeah. But primarily it is reading, right? It is Soviet post-Holocaust culture is a reading culture. Yeah. But it was absolutely known, which again is something that I think people in the West and the United States don't understand. So for instance, if you read articles about Zelensky, president of Ukraine, is very much a product of the Soviet Jewish bookshelf. He's just a year younger than me. He comes from a very similar milieu and kind of background that I come from. And so a number of statements that Zelensky made about the war, etc. He's a politician. He needs to say what he needs to say. But then you read all these articles published here, and that said, of course he doesn't know anything about the Holocaust, because what did Soviet Jews know about the Holocaust? Yeah, and that's wrong. And that's wrong because they're not aware of this huge kind of cultural realm. Yeah. Okay, so let's get into it. Yeah, and we'll concentrate mainly kind of on the works of written in Russian, and I know some of them you've been reading, but I want to begin with this one. Again, just to give you an idea how Jewish knowledge was obtained and how reading really functioned, reading novels functioned as kind of reading scripture. So the first writer is Leon Feuchtwanger. I'm sure that name means probably nobody knows that name. Yeah? So Leon Feuchtwanger, except for Professor Schreier. Leon Feuchtwanger was an incredibly popular German Jewish novelist from the 1920s and on, writing these very, very important historical novels. He was very much a person of the left, and so when Hitler comes to power, Feuchtwanger leaves and ends up in the United States, where he lives until the end of his life in mid-1950s in LA, in Pacific Palisades. So a lot of novels, a lot of Feuchtwanger's novels deal with Jewish subjects. He writes this beautiful trilogy about Josephus, this ancient Jewish historian who wrote about Jewish rebellion against Rome and the destruction of the temple and how Jews lost independence. He writes about the medieval Jewish history. He also writes about modern Jewish history. And so his novels, which were translated widely, this is in a Russian bookstore in Moscow in 2019 when I was there, beautiful edition of his collected works, that became the scripture for Soviet Jews. There was hardly a house, and whether you were in Moscow, or you were in Khmelnytsky, Ukraine, or you were in Riga, Latvia, or Lviv in Western Ukraine, you would have Feuchtwanger, right? So why these books were so important? Not just because they talked about the Jewish stuff, and sort of really taught you what it means to be a Jew, but also because at the end of these volumes, you had commentaries and appendices, scholarly, that provided tons of information about everything Jewish, Jewish history, Jewish scripture, Jewish religion, etc., etc., etc. Right? So again, you can't find this anywhere else, but you can find it there, So to give you an example, when I was, 10, 11, something like that, 12, my mom took a volume of Feuchtwanger from our bookcase, gave it to me and said, you have to read it to understand what it means to be a Jew, right? So not just read it because it's a great work of literature, but because it's important for you, for your identity, for who you are, And let me quote you somebody that you know, Professor Schreier, who writes beautifully in his memoir, Leaving Russia, a Jewish Story. And he remembers how in Moscow, he and his friend, says, we were enthusiastic readers of historical fiction, from Sir Walter Scott and Prosper Mérimée to Vasily Yan, Heinrich Mann, and Leon Feuchtwanger, whose novel, The Spanish Ballad, we both read not as fiction, but as a true story of Jewish pride and valor. Right? So here is a testimony. And I found tons of similar testimonies, not all of them as eloquent as this one, but essentially said the same thing, right? That's the role that Feuchtwanger played for us, right? We looked at it as kind of living history, very pertinent to our identity. And it's very interesting, and these stories are also kind of, you find them across the board. When Soviet Jews came to the United States or came to Israel, when they immigrated, and they start talking about Feuchtwanger, and nobody knows who Feuchtwanger is. That was the impetus for me wanting to write this book. When I was a student, just like you, at Columbia University in New York, having lived in this country only a couple of years, and I went to talk to my German professor, and I started talking about Feuchtwanger. And he looked at me and he said, why? I mean, he's sort of forgotten and a secondary tier writer. Why do you want to talk about Feuchtwanger? And to me, it's like, well, what do you mean? So Feuchtwanger, right? And here is an example. Sort of going back to your question. Why was Feuchtwanger published with all this Jewish stuff? Well, because he was recognized as an important writer and very much a man of the left who supported the Soviet Union in some very problematic ways. He comes to the Soviet Union in 1937, meets with Stalin. Read my book and you'll kind of get the whole story. But also with him, you could get all these commentaries. Which you would not find with works written in Russian, as we'll now see. So let's leave Feuchtwanger and come to what I call kind of the core, salvage fragments. And by the core, I mean the books written in Russian, books of Russian literature. So here's a wonderful photograph. I found it in Moscow. A Jewish family, 1960s, probably 1970s, And of course here, what do you have? you have these bookcases filled with books, and in general, because Soviet Union, everything, there was a shortage of everything. You couldn't just go and buy things, right? You had to have connections, you had to stand in lines. That was especially true of books, right? Books became treasures that everybody hunted after and wanted to have. Yeah, and some even had them not because they wanted to read them, but because they kind of looked really cool in these bookcases, and people would sort of find colors that would work well with their wallpaper. Yeah, these are not sort of what I'm interested in, but just to give you that idea of how it was such an indelible part of sort of the air of that time. So first, the classics of Russian literature. Yeah, which you would have on those bookshelves. Yeah. And here we have everybody. We have Nikolai Gogol, Turgenev, Lermontov, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Chekhov up there. Right here, this wonderful portrait of Pushkin as a kind of Orthodox Jew. Yeah. So there was a real love for these books by many Soviet Jews. You grew up with them, right? They were a source of everything, inspiration, etc., etc. This was also the works that you would study at school. But there were these stumbling blocks, right? Because the depictions of Jews, by and large, in 19th century Russian literature are not favorable at all. They vary from kind of neutral ones to really, really horrendously negative ones. Yeah, and so there are these stumbling blocks. Yeah, and the one example that I provide, and that comes from my kind of personal memory. I remember reading Pushkin's novel Captain's Daughter, Kapitanskaya Dochka, and just loving it. And then you come to this place where these two officers are kind of hanging out, and they don't know what to do with themselves. And one of them says, "Well, you can't just go beat up the Jews all the time." Yeah, and the word that is used is the word Zhid. Yeah, which is tremendously derogatory. Today, in Pushkin's times, it was less so, but still. And that kind of hits you. Here's Pushkin that you love, yeah? And who says these things about people like you, yeah? And for some, they would sort of look over these stumbling blocks. For some, it would, leave an imprint, yeah? And you would need to figure out what to do with it. And that's Pushkin. But what happens when you come to somebody like Dostoevsky, who was a horrendous anti-Semite, or Nikolai Gogol, who has these horrific depictions of violence against Jews, yeah, and kind of marveling at that violence, yeah. So these stumbling blocks, yeah. Then we come to the period, another layer, the period some of these writers you've been reading, yeah. And so what happens during this thaw period? You have a rediscovery of the writers who were banned, persecuted, killed under Stalin. Yeah, you have a whole new generation of writers. So let me give you some examples. And it's interesting that some of the books that become so important during this thaw period for everybody, but they become especially important for Jews. So here on the left we have this writer, Ilya Ehrenburg. A tremendously prolific and interesting person. He was a journalist, he was a poet, he was a fiction writer. He was very much kind of a man of the world, cosmopolitan, friends with people like Picasso and others, spending his time in Paris, but also returning to the Soviet Union, becoming a very important figure under Stalin and surviving through all of that. So he knew how to kind of play the game. He knew how to survive. But after Stalin's death during this thaw period, he becomes absolutely instrumental. He's actually the one who comes up with this term, the thaw, ottepel, right? Writes a book that has that title. So Ehrenburg, who was Jewish, was born in Kiev, Ukrainian Jew, yeah? And that sense of Jewishness was always important to him to some extent, but it becomes especially important during World War II, because he sees what is happening, right? Jewish people are being exterminated. And so it becomes really important during this thaw period. And Ehrenburg writes during this period his memoirs, multi-volume memoirs that are called People, Years, Life, Люди, Годы, Жизнь. Yeah? They cover everything from the beginning of his life until really the current day. And there are tons of Jewish fragments in that book. Yeah? Some have to do with pre-revolutionary Jewish life, a lot have to do with the Holocaust, a lot have to do with Soviet Yiddish culture that was decimated by Stalin. So these memoirs, written beautifully, they become an encyclopedia for for the readers, and especially for Soviet Jews. Yeah, and Ehrenburg was a wonderful example of what it means to write between the lines and expecting his readers to read between the lines. Yeah, he clearly did not say everything that he wanted to say, right? Because he realized that the regime tells you you can do that little, and that's that little. You have to stretch that little to its utmost limits. So Ehrenburg is crucial here. Another figure that I know you've read, Isaac Babin. What did you read by Babin?
Awakening, but I've also read Red Cavalry around time.
Okay, excellent. Red Cavalry, his short stories like Awakening, right? So Babin, this really, really important writer from the 1920s, comes from Odessa, right? This fascinating kind of cosmopolitan city where the Jewish element was so strong, killed by Stalin. Yeah, so he's rediscovered, readmitted into the canon during this thaw period. His works are published again, and his works are replete with everything Jewish, Jewish characters, Jewish themes, yeah, everything. Now, unlike Feuchtwanger, where you would have these appendices and commentaries at the back, there was nothing like that with Babin. Why? Because the Soviet regime did not want to admit that there can be writers who kind of have this bifurcated identity. They're both Russian writers and Jewish writers. No, they would not allow that. Yeah, but here also with Babin, you did not have to really read between the lines because it was just soaked in everything Jewish, right? So here is Babin. Another writer that is very important, I don't think you've read, yeah? Vasily Grossman, really, really important writer who also starts to write end of the 1920s, 1930s, very much kind of a writer of that new Soviet generation. Also Ukrainian Jew, comes from the city of Berdichev, yeah? Just like Ehrenburg during the war, during the Holocaust, he becomes much more aware of his Jewishness because again, he sees the catastrophe that's unfolding, and he writes a number of very, very important works that deal with the Holocaust, but also that say something absolutely incredible for its time. And essentially what Grossman says is that Stalinism and Nazism are mirrors of each other. Yeah? He writes it in his novel, Life and Fate, Жизнь и Судьба. As you can imagine, that novel cannot be published, right? KGB comes into his apartment in Moscow and seizes it, arrests the manuscript. Luckily, a couple of his friends have the manuscript and it's published in the West in France a little bit later. But a number of Grossman's work, just while regime is hounding him, going back to your question about censorship, they're continuing to publish his works. And a number of them that are published in the early 1960s have quite a bit of Jewishness in them and quite a bit about the Holocaust. For instance, Grossman's travelogue to Armenia. Yeah, it really is a Holocaust text. Or a number of his stories. Yeah, so Professor Schreier mentioned this other book that I wrote about the film Commissar. Yeah, made in 1967 and destroyed, not released, and released only 20 years later in 1987. So that film is based on Grossman's earlier story in the town of Berdichev, but it is published in the 1960s. Yeah, and everybody can read it. Yeah, and then these two writers, who also I don't think you've read. Yeah, and that's Ilya Ilf and Evgeny Petrov. They also come from Odessa. Yeah, and Odessa is really, really important in this context. I call it kind of the Odessan terrain. You have Odessa in the 1960s. This port on the Black Sea, a tremendously cosmopolitan city, the city that always had that kind of core Jewish component that is also so crucial in the development of 20th century Russian literature. I think you've read Shklovsky. Yes? So Shklovsky, who was of course an important formalist critic, a writer, himself also Jewish, right? He says that the writers who come from Odessa, he calls it the Southwestern school, he says that they revolutionized, transformed Russian literature because they brought kind of this new spirit into it. They brought the Odessan dialect into it. So in the Soviet context, this city, Odessa, is sort of one of the very few legitimate Jewish spaces. Yeah, you say Odessa, and immediately it conjures up kind of various Jewish elements. Yeah, and you see it in theater, you see it in Soviet humor, and of course you see it in literature. Yeah, and so all these writers, again, like Ilf and Petrov, who write this very famous duology, The Golden Calf and The 12 Chairs, are part of that. Yeah, are part of that, and we can talk more about that. So here's the edition of Babil, 1966, the second edition of Babil after during the thaw. If you read my book, you'll see why this volume was so interesting, not just because, of course, of the content of Babil's works, but also because of the preface. The preface that really emphasized Babil's Jewishness, right? So with these books, within kind of the Soviet Jewish context, it's not just kind of the actual content of the work that really matters, but also what's around them. Like the commentaries to Feuchtwanger or a preface written to Babil's volume. Yeah? Questions? So far so good? Okay. So I also wanted to give you this example. Yeah. This writer, and by the way, his autobiography that is so important in this context was just translated into English and came out a few months ago. And that's Konstantin Paustovsky, yeah, who was also very much part of this Odessan world. Now it's interesting, Paustovsky was not Jewish, yeah, but he was what's called a philo-Semite, right? He was in love with Jewish culture. He was Babil's friend. He knew all these Jewish writers, and he was instrumental in kind of in the way that they returned in the during the thaw in the 1960s. Yeah, and so Paustovsky was very much part of this Soviet Jewish bookshelf, and I'll give you one.
Let me just make a comment. Guys, look whose portrait is on the wall of Paustovsky's study. Who can recognize? It's a writer we read in this course earlier on. He was an emigre. He was the first Russian language writer to win the Nobel Prize. Yes, do you see that?
Which is also very symbolic.
Yes. Yes.
Because Bunin was sort of kind of the second tier somewhere in the official Soviet context. Yeah. So the fact that he has Bunin's portrait is very symbolic.
And also because Bunin is an emigre.
Yeah,
so it's a very important picture.
Yeah, we hated the Soviets.
Yeah.
Right? So I wanted to give you this one quote from Paustovsky's memoir about Babil, right? And first of all, this first quotation. Paustovsky says, despite my attachment to the Russian language, at times it seems to me that it is inferior in terms of melodiousness, precision, and some other respects to other languages, in particular French and Italian, Hebrew, and even Dutch. Right? It's, okay, fine. There's nothing unusual here. But what absolutely stands out, and would so stand out to those who are reading it, when it's published in the 1960s, is what? The mention of Hebrew. Hebrew, which was always a deeply suspect language in the Soviet context, and becomes an absolutely kind of anathema language because of the break of diplomatic relations between Israel and the Soviet Union. And so here's Paustovsky including Hebrew in this, in this rank of melodious languages, and it's fascinating. Which of course it means that he must have had some knowledge of Hebrew, right? And it's a signal that he is sending. Again, thinking, kind of reading between the lines and what this would mean to the overall audience and what it mean to the specific Jewish audience. And this is what he remembers about Babil. Concerning Babil, I will consider him a very talented writer, and bear my head before his cruel and senseless death, as well as before many other of our wonderful writers and poets, no matter their nationality. If the editorial board of Novy Mir thinks otherwise, that should be on their conscience. So Paustovsky's memoirs are being published in Novy Mir, this major journal during this period, and the head, Tvardovsky, very important poet, says everything is great, but you talk too much about Babil. Right, and he kind of suggests that you talk too much about him because he was Jewish. So you shouldn't probably do that. And here's Paustovsky responding, right? And it's clear that here he knows why they're attacking him, right? Because of Babil's Jewishness. And this is kind of his rebellious, very dignified response. And in fact, he would stop publishing his memoirs in Novy Mir and take it somewhere else. And then this is what he remembers about Babil. And he's quoting what Babil says to him. I did not choose my nationality. I'm a Jew, a Yid, here's the word Zhid. Sometimes it seems to me that I can understand everything, but one thing I will never understand, the cause of that dark villainy which has so boringly been labeled as anti-Semitism. Paustovsky added, how could I respond to him? I was silent. Yeah. So again, imagine, you live in a country where, again, there's kind of this empty place where Jewishness is supposed to be. The very word Jew, Yivrei, if you say it out loud in a public space, people either start laughing or start cursing, yeah? But it's just like, don't say it, you shouldn't say this. And here's Postovsky talking about Babin as a Jew, as a Jewish writer, talking about anti-Semitism, right? And it's very interesting. I was silent. What does this silence mean, right? What is behind that silence? Yeah, try to appreciate it. And again, minority discourses, minority cultures are similar. I'm talking about the Jewish case, but we can think about other minority case, African American case in the American context. Yeah, we can talk about sexual minorities, other minorities. Minorities are similar in how they sort of survive and how they operate in an environment that doesn't want them. Yeah, so I think this can serve as a model for other minorities. How are we on time? Another 10 minutes or 10 minutes?
Maybe 5 minutes.
5 minutes, yeah? Okay. All right, so let me skip that. And let's talk a little bit about the Holocaust. So the Holocaust corpus, right? So again, yeah, there's that memory of the Holocaust, because there was hardly a family that did not lose somebody, who died at the front fighting, and of course those who were killed. Yeah, and the way that the Holocaust was carried out in the Soviet Union by the Nazis is different from how it was carried out, let's say, in Poland, right? So you're all aware of death camps, places like Auschwitz and Sobibor and Treblinka. In the Soviet Union, as it was occupied, parts of it were occupied by the Nazis, Jews were exterminated through massacres. Yeah, they would be taken to ravines outside of their towns, so they would be shot right near the places where they lived. Yeah, and so you have these ravines scattered throughout Ukraine, Belarus, and parts of Russia. Yeah, and people carried that memory. A lot of Soviet Jews survived because they were evacuated. Yeah, they were evacuated by the Soviet government. Now to Central Asia, to some parts of Russia. They were evacuated not because they were Jews. Yeah, but they were evacuated because they worked in certain industries and would be evacuated with everybody else. But because of that, quite a few Soviet Jews did survive. That's how my grandparents survived. Yeah, and that's maybe true of your family as well. Yeah, some.
Those who survived.
Those who survived. Yes, those who survived. Yeah, of course there were those who were not evacuated and were shot, but quite a few survived through evacuation. Yeah. So let's think about some of these texts that carried that Holocaust memory, and here Ehrenburg is very important. So the translation of the Diary of Anne Frank, right? The text that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, right? So when it's published in the early 1960s in Russian, it is an enormous event, right? And to have this book that openly, right? This was a Holocaust book, openly so, was just tremendously important. But again, especially it was important not just because of the content of the diary, but because of the preface, which was written by Ilya Ehrenburg. Yeah, and Ehrenburg was instrumental in bringing the Diary of Anne Frank to the Soviet public. This is a quotation from his preface. Everyone knows that the Hitlerites murdered 6 million Jews, the citizens of 20 countries, rich and poor, the famous and the unknown. So here you really have to read between the lines, because on the one hand, he absolutely explicitly states 6 million Jews, not 6 million people, but 6 million Jews, right? So he presents the Holocaust as a Jewish catastrophe. But he's also being ironic. And this is where you need to read between the lines. Everyone knows. Why does he say everyone knows? Because he knows that not everyone knows. And not only does not everyone know, but the Soviet government is doing everything in their power so that everybody would not know. Yeah? And again, you can just sort of read it plainly, but then you look what's between the lines. The atom bomb fell in Hiroshima suddenly. It was impossible to take cover. For several years, the Hitlerites organized raids and millions of people like the hunters chasing wolves. Jews tried to disappear by hiding in pits, in abandoned mines, in the crevices of cities. 6 million were asphyxiated in gas chambers, shot in ravines or in forts, condemned to a slow death from hunger. Yeah? And this is also, so he's giving you the history of the Holocaust in a few sentences. And it is tremendously important because death camps, yes, it was absolutely talked about, right? In Soviet textbooks, films, etc. But it's very, very important that he mentions this, shot in ravines, because he talks about then what was happening in Soviet territories. And everybody, especially Jews, when they see this, not only do they think about the Nazis who were murdering, but they also think about the accomplices, the local accomplices. They think about collaboration, a topic that was absolutely not touched in the official Soviet discourse. Yeah? One voice speaks for these 6 million. It is not the voice of a wise man or a poet, but of an ordinary young girl. It's very, very interesting. I looked at the translation of Anne Frank's diary that comes out in the United States, and is also a very, very important event, because then there's a film that Hollywood film that is based on it, and looked at the review of Anne Frank's diary in the New York Times, written by an important person, and it's almost exactly the same. Right? He says exactly the same. So I think Ehrenburg actually was aware of the New York Times report. They knew what the Diary of Anne Frank did for American Jewry, and wanted to do the same for Soviet Jewry. Yeah. Another example of a book that just becomes so important, a memoir by this woman, Masha Ornikaite, who was in the Vilna ghetto in Lithuania during the war, and she writes this memoir about her time there, first in Yiddish, then in Lithuanian, and finally it comes out in the Russian translation. And look at this. This is also kind of very interesting. It is a Holocaust book through and through. Yes, it was edited, certain parts were taken out, but at the same time the core stayed. And it's clear absolutely what she's talking about. But look at how this is published in Russian, right? And how it's presented. This is a typical socialist, realist, painting, right? So they're sort of making sure that it fits within this overall narrative of the war, that official narrative of the war. And as a reader, you have to kind of know how to navigate the content, and this. And the last example, that's the last example that I'll give, and then we'll have question. Book that also Professor Schreier wrote about, by Anatoly Rybakov, who's a very popular writer. Yeah, he wrote a lot of books for teenagers, kind of these detective stories for teenagers. He was also writing some pretty serious novels that had to do with Stalinism that he could not publish, and published only later during the Perestroika reforms. So in the 1970s, he writes this book called Heavy Sand, Тяжелый песок, which on the one hand is a very typical Soviet story about the war and resistance, and it's just, a Soviet book through and through. But on the other hand, it is a thoroughly Jewish book, because of its characters, because of how openly it talks about the Holocaust, yeah, and how openly it talks about what it means to be a Soviet Jew, yeah. And so just like I told you that example when my mom took the volume of Feuchtwanger and gave it to me and said, read it to know what it means to be a Jew, my grandfather always would do this. He would always take this book, Heavy Sand, from his bookcase, give it to me and say, you have to read it to know what it means to be a Soviet Jew. And as a teenager, I didn't understand what that, and I sort of brushed him off. Now I completely understand. what he meant. Yeah. And so I give you, we don't have time to read it. Yeah. But the ending of the book, where you have the protagonist coming back to the place where the massacre took place in his native town, and it's very, very autobiographical. Yeah. But maybe let's read it. Yeah. It's a powerful passage. Yeah. So he says, it was a sad picture, the deserted cemetery, almost without headstones, without monuments, without inscriptions. Where were the graves of my forefathers? Cedar of Anai. So there's a Russian man that comes with him. Cedar of Anai stood for a while in silence, then we went to the communal grave. A large slab of granite had been erected above the grave, and on it was engraved in Russian. So this is the actual monument in Rybakov's native town. And this is the monument that he has in mind. So it was engraved in Russian, to the eternal memory of the victims of the German fascist invaders. A very kind of neutral language, very Soviet language. Below it, right, so here you have the Russian. Here it's actually above, yeah. Below it was an inscription in Hebrew. Sidorov pointed to the inscription in Russian and Hebrew and asked me quietly, tell me, Boris, did they translate the Russian text right? As a child, I had gone to Heder, which is a traditional Jewish school. Then I transferred to a Russian school, and I'd long ago forgotten the Hebrew characters. Yet nearly 60 years later, those letters and those words came back to me from the unknown and eternal depth of my memory. Very powerful, right? I remembered them, and I read, Benikoisi domom loinikoisi. The meaning of those words is everything is forgiven, but those who have spilled innocent blood shall never be forgiven. So here's this quotation. It's a quotation from Hebrew Bible, from a minor prophet, Yeah, he doesn't give us the full quotation. Yeah, and in fact, only part of the quotation is also on this monument. Sidorov asked, "Well, did they get it right?" Yes, I said it's right. It's exact. Of course, they didn't. They didn't. But here you have to read between the lines. You have to read between the lines. You have to see what Rybakov is doing with this inscription, right? He takes God from the Hebrew quote and going to substitute people's memory with God, right? And so here you have this double layeredness, this Russian Soviet statement and then this Hebrew statement, yeah? And there's so much around it, yeah? And so that book, published completely officially, was a bestseller, was translated to English and really became bestseller in the United States. Elie Wiesel wrote a wonderful positive review of it when it came out in English in the United States, right? That book became sort of another scripture for Soviet Jews. They knew that they had to read it between the lines. They knew that a lot was simplified in it, but it carried tremendous, tremendous importance. It's interesting that Professor Schreier's father, very important writer in his own right, who was sort of writing things that could not be published, working in the underground, but he says that he mentions this book is one of, I think, the 5 most important Jewish books that he thinks are written in the 20th century, along also with Feuchtwanger. Yeah. So there you go. So I give you some glimpses kind of into the Soviet bookshelves. There is more. There's more, and you can take a look at the book. And so thank you. And
Thank you. I am just coming to help the moderator. Thank you so much. We learned so much. And before we open the floor, I just want to share a personal anecdote, which has to do so much with what Professor Greenberg talked about, the strategies of writing between the lines, but also reading. So can we go back to the Feuchtwanger bookcase? So basically, I was inspired by Marat to visit the house where Feuchtwanger lived in Pacific Palisades. I don't know if you guys, any of you are from the LA area, but it's a beautiful, beautiful place. And he actually, and this is one of the paradoxes, was very successful because he did very well in translation. He was also a Hollywood writer. He, unlike many exiles from Germany and Austria, could afford a very luxuriant home, which is still there. And I visited yesterday, inspired by Marat's research. But basically, my story, and so when I was there, I was thinking about this Oxblood famous edition, multi-volume. So Marat and I have many connections, but one of them is that we have a connection to the city of Kamenets-Podilsk, where both of my grandfathers were born and grew up. And so my maternal grandfather, who left Ukraine in his 20s, who came to Moscow, he worked as a stonemason, paver, and then he went to university, but he never shed the skin of a Ukrainian Jew. And one of the things he never shed is he had a strong knowledge of Yiddish, but also Hebrew. And later, when I got hold of the letters that he wrote to his sibling in Israel, he would write in Russian, but then he would say certain things in Hebrew. But basically, he worshipped Feuchtwanger. And he had this set in his apartment where, of course, I went as a kid. When he died, I was 9, and the set was there. And then a very strange thing happened. So my late grandmother had an older brother who was a typical example of, on the surface, a fully assimilated Soviet Jew. He basically swore by the front page articles of Pravda. He was very critical of anything Jewishly self-conscious. He would take me aside, and we were already refusing, and he would say, Maxime, I want you to believe in the genius of Marx and Lenin, but don't tell your parents I said that, and stuff like that. So this is the interesting part. When my grandfather died, he approached my grandmother, his sister, and said that he wants to buy this set from her. And she said, well, it's not really for sale, but why? He said, because I want to have it in my house and preserve your husband's memories. But of course, guys, it wasn't just that. Right. This was very hard to come by. It was selling for many times what it was worth officially. Yeah. So I think he wanted in his lair, in his apartment, to have this bit of Jewishness that he would privately enjoy. Yeah. So I think what you said makes so much sense. Even though on the broad surface, he was this perfect Soviet citizen. So thank you for all of this. And guys, let's interrogate Professor Greenberg a little, right?
Yeah, please.
Yes. So questions.
Yes.
Yeah, so I just have a question. We talked about it a little bit, but what were some of the books in particular, or the content in those books that were eventually published and then were like you no longer publish them anymore, and you said like
Yeah.
they were hidden within those bookshelves?
Great. So let me show you an example here. Okay, so you know, the relation between Israel, the Jewish state, and the Soviet Union were never good, even though the Soviet Union was the first state to recognize the state of Israel when it was declared, right? They were hoping that they would become kind of a socialist bastion in the Middle East. It doesn't work out that way. And then there is a break of diplomatic relations between Israel and the Soviet Union after 1967, the Six-Day War, where Israel was triumphant in this war against the Arab armies. But in the early 1960s, there are a number of books that come out that are translations of Israeli literature, translations of Hebrew literature. So here are some of them. So this wonderful volume, this slim book called Poeta Israel, The Poets of Israel, yeah, which was an anthology of Israeli poetry, a pretty good anthology of Israeli poetry. It was also edited by this person that Professor Schreier mentioned when introducing me, Boris Slutsky, here on the left, a very, very important Soviet Jewish figure, yeah. And on the Israeli side, it was this poet, Alexander Pan, who was a communist, who also came to then Palestine from Russia. Very, very interesting Russian poet, who then becomes a Hebrew poet. Yeah, and so books like that, and there were quite a few. There was a volume of Israeli prose. Yeah, a number of these books. When you get into the post-1967, post-Six-Day War period, when Israel is declared as the arch enemy and the most horrendous entity in the world, yeah, if you have these books, you have to be very, very careful. You would hide them in your bookcase, yeah, because if they were discovered, you would be in trouble. Also, the copies of these books that would be in public libraries, you could no longer get them. Right? You could no longer get them. You would need to have a special permission. So again, if you had a copy like that, and I have to say, those who did have those books, you could get in the larger cities, you know, in Moscow, in Leningrad. It was very hard to get them in the periphery because the print runs were much smaller than, say, the collected writings of Feuchtwanger or these Russian works. But here is one example, yeah, of what would be, you know, how it depended on politics, essentially, yeah. I think you had a hand.
Yeah. How accessible or perhaps inaccessible were Jewish religious texts?
Okay, great question. I love those questions. Okay, so let me give you another example. Right. So again, as I said, all religions are kind of horrible in the Soviet context, even though according to the Soviet constitution there is freedom of religion. If you want to be religious, if you're an idiot enough to be religious, you can. In reality, it meant that you couldn't, right? If somebody saw you attending a church service or a synagogue service, you'd be fired from your job. You have all sorts of issues. So really only the elderly could do this, right? And there was a field of social sciences established in the Soviet Union. It was a field of scientific atheism, naучный atheism, which meant a study of religion from a Marxist perspective. And within this field, there were quite a few books published about Judaism. Then again, from a Marxist perspective, so here's one example, this book published in the 1960s that is called Zakat Иудейской религии, the dusk of Judaic religion. Ooh, right, I mean, it's bad, dusk, etc. However, here, writing and reading between the lines is very, very important. It was written by this very, very interesting scholar, Mikhail Shakhnovich. Yeah, was a deeply educated person when it, in terms of Judaism, Jewish religion, Jewish history. Yeah, he wrote this book, and he really wrote it. That is, he really wrote it between the lines. Later on, he gave an interview in which he explicitly says the only way that we could talk about Judaism was from this Marxist perspective, and to an extent he believed into all of this, right? But he says at the same time, this was the only way that we can provide some history of Judaism. And indeed, if you take this book now, and you take a pencil, you can cross out the ideological stuff. Yeah, in some cases you would read between the lines. So for instance, in this book, which is essentially a history of Judaism, he inserts a small section on the Holocaust, where he talks about the 6 million Jews, right? Because only in a book like that you could really say that. Yeah. So here's an example, or another scholar from this cohort is Bielinki. yeah, who also wrote all these books about Judaism, how horrible it is, but also wrote this very, very interesting biography of Spinoza, right, this Jewish philosopher from Amsterdam, who is excommunicated by the Jewish community, kind of this first real modern Jew, who's part of the wider world, but also wants to kind of remain a Jew. And this biography you really have to read between the lines, and there's these really, really interesting passages. So this is, on the one hand, it's propaganda literature, but on the other hand, these are very rich Jewish documents, right? And in order to be able to appreciate them, you have to understand the context. And another really interesting example, and I talked about that yesterday in Professor Sienkiewicz's course on anti-Semitism here, is books that dealt with Zionism and Israel, yeah? And they were horrendous. They were essentially anti-Semitic books, right? So here's one example that you see of a book like that, and you have kind of capitals of the world, right? And so what do you have in the middle? You have swastika, and you have the Jewish star. So essentially saying that the two control the world. Very unfortunately, we live with this image. We live with these images today. You find them everywhere. Yeah. Now, even books like that would be bought by Soviet Jews. Sometimes they would buy them just because so they wanted to make sure nobody else would buy them, and would sort of, they would get rid of them. But very often they would also try to read them by crossing out the lines, but reading between the lines, as difficult as it was, to obtain some information about Israel. Because there was a great deal of solidarity on the part of Soviet Jews with Israel. So even a horrendous book like that, you know how to deal with it, right? You need to, you know kind of what to do with it.
Right.
Is that- yeah.
Just to jump in, I think Jack was also wondering whether you could actually buy the scriptures again.
Oh yes, thank you,
right?
thank you. So, and I'll get to your question. Let me give you. So here's an example. You can't go and buy Bible. You just can't, right? Unless you have some special connections. But by and large, you couldn't. At the same time, as I said, synagogues stayed open in larger cities like Moscow and Leningrad. So there was a functioning synagogue in Moscow that had its own Siddur prayer book. Again, on the one hand, they worked very closely with the government, with the KGB. On the other hand, they tried to provide some sort of religious life for those who needed it. So here's that Siddur, the prayer book, Siddur HaShalom from the 1960s. How else do you get scripture? So here's what I found in the Jewish Museum in Moscow in their library. So here is Novy Mir, this very, very important journal that I talked about, 1962. You open it up, and what do you see? There is no Novy Mir. Instead, you have Sefer Shmot, yeah, the book of Exodus, sewn into it. Yeah, it's hidden there. How many of these were? I don't know, right? How widespread it was. And the question that really interests me: those who did it, did they also read Novy Mir and this, or did they not hear? Do you see what I mean? Yeah. And then you had these popular retelling. It goes back to the question of censorship. Popular retellings of the Hebrew Bible. So this one by Zenon Kosidowski, who's a Polish scholar, who wrote these books, retellings of the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, with tons of archaeological evidence, and also incredibly positive. He talks about the Hebrew Bible as this great literary document, and the history of Jews is this marvelous thing. All of this is published officially, millions and millions of copies, right? So here is kind of a paradox, why some things are published, why some things are not published. Yeah? Yes?
Why is it that the Soviet government positioned themselves in a manner that almost agreed with the fascists here? You'd think that they would position themselves in opposition to anti-Semitism, to contradict and stand on the other side of the Nazis on this, but it's ironic and doesn't seem to make much sense that they would almost place themselves on the same side of the issue.
Are you talking about the specifically kind of
Just
regarding Israel or general
Generally
Soviet anti-Semitism?
about, Soviet anti-Semitism.
It's a complicated question. Some of it has to do with the long history of Russian anti-Semitism in the Russian Empire, right? Some of it has to do with Stalin and his kind of understanding of the Jewish question. Some of it has to do with just absolute ineptness and idiocy of the Soviet regime, right? And particularly it has to do with these books about Israel and Zionism, right? These were political decisions. Yes, often fed by kind of hatred and anti-Semitism, but they were sort of seen, okay, so in this war, in the context of the Cold War, we're siding with the Arabs, right? And so we need to kind of really push this line against Israel, really push it by then equating kind of Nazism and Zionism, yeah? A lot of it, again, has to do with kind of these suspicions of double loyalty, and this is where the refusnik movement comes into play. But it's convoluted. Right? Because in reality, also, despite all this persecution that was happening behind the scenes, right, Soviet Jews were an integral part of Soviet society. I mean, they were the intelligentsia, they were the professionals, they were the doctors, the teachers, they were involved in commerce, they were the writers, etc., right? So it's hard to find one, I mean, it was simplistic to say, the Soviet regime was just, evil, anti-Semitic. That's simplistic. It also depends on which epoch we're talking about. Yeah, but a lot of had to do with that sort of ineptness and just idiocy of the Soviet regime. Geography also matters here. So, for instance, anti-Semitism was much more prevalent in Ukraine than in other places, and that had to do with a very long history of Ukrainian anti-Semitism and a very difficult history of Ukrainian-Jewish relations. Yeah. And if you look at why his memory of the Holocaust was obfuscated, again, first was kind of this fear of drawing attention to the Jewish, sort of to the Jewish question, and again, kind of Stalin's anti-Semitism, and so there's all these reasons that don't always make logical sense.
Yeah, we unfortunately have to stop, but this is a great place to stop because, guys, we will continue exploring this question when we talk about the second half of Tikhon's novel, House on the Embankment, which is precisely about how complex and deeply intertwined things were in Soviet culture. So let's thank Professor Greenberg again.